The question you bring up about AI and how that influences our practice today, I think is also really important. At Biogen, there's been a real concerted effort to evaluate every concept that comes in where there's an application of AI. And it starts really with three premises. Number one, what are we solving for? And is it something that should be solved for with AI? Number two, how are we going to measure success and when are we going to measure success? And we need to outline that up front, and we need to be very disciplined about evaluating that as we go forward. And then third, and probably the most important, we then need to hold ourselves accountable and make sure that we pull that through if it actually brings advantage, or be sure that we just move on if it doesn't offer any significant advantage to the company.
Today's guest sits at the intersection of medicine, science, and leadership at one of the most influential biotech companies in the world. As Chief Medical Officer, CMO, and Head of Medical Affairs at Biogen, Dr. Daniel Quirk helps guide clinical and medical strategy across some of the most complex and closely watched disease states in medicine, particularly in neuroscience and rare diseases. He has responsibilities spanning clinical development, medical affairs, and scientific integrity, and his work directly shapes how innovation moves from the lab to patients and how that science is ultimately communicated to healthcare providers and regulators. Daniel has many years of experience as a senior pharma industry executive working at companies such as Pfizer and BMS. Daniel received his MD from Brown University, an MPH from Harvard, and an MBA from Wharton. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Will, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to share information about the new Biogen. The evolution of Biogen is really what attracted me to join the organization about 13 months ago.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more. So let's talk a little bit about your role as Chief Medical Officer at Biogen. How do you see the role of Chief Medical Officer evolving today, especially, let's kind of just talk broadly at this intersection of what's happening with policy, clinical, medical, and even now digital enablement. A lot of things have changed within medical affairs in the last year or 18 months just because of the advent of AI. Talk to me a little bit about how that CMO you think is evolving both at Biogen and in the industry in general.
It's a great question, Will. But I think even before we get into the current role of CMO, I think it's important to reframe what the responsibility of medical affairs is. And I'll also view that through the lens of my background as well. I mean, at the heart of what I do, 30 years I've spent actually directly or indirectly related to clinical care. 10 years through training, and then 20 years actually at the bedside, caring for patients. I really believe that medical affairs is an extension of that. At the heart of everything we do, we need to understand that relationship between the patient and the provider. And we need to make sure that the information that we're able to provide to the medical community helps the right decisions get made at the right time in the best interest of that patient. Whether that's 10 years ago or whether that's today, and we're speaking about how we incorporate AI into that paradigm, the heart of what we do still has to maintain that focus on the patient. The question you bring up about AI and how that influences our practice today, I think is also really important. At Biogen, there's been a real concerted effort to evaluate every concept that comes in where there's an application of AI. And it starts really with three premises. Number one, what are we solving for? And is it something that should be solved for with AI? Number two, how are we going to measure success and when are we going to measure success? And we need to outline that up front, and we need to be very disciplined about evaluating that as we go forward. And then third, and probably the most important, we then need to hold ourselves accountable and make sure that we pull that through if it actually brings advantage, or be sure that we just move on if it doesn't offer any significant advantage to the company. And that solution also has to be scalable across the organization.
Now, I want to take a step back. You were talking about your time as a clinician. What made you ultimately make the transition to go to industry?
Yes, so I have to say I was really blessed. I had 20 years of practice and I enjoyed every single day. I was actually making my way towards more of a leadership role in health systems in particular, which is why I was getting the MBA. So I was fortunate when I joined Thomas Jefferson. I met with the chief of gastroenterology then, which is J.D. Monroe, and this was about the time of the Affordable Care Act. And I said, based on my prior experience, I had a lot of leadership roles. I really wanted to take on more of an administrative role to help kind of change the evolution of healthcare delivery. So that was the premise for the MBA. And it was during that period, which is about 2 years, where I met a number of people from industry. And they really opened my eyes. They were classmates about what industry was. To be quite frank, I had no idea what medical affairs was and what advantages it could bring, and really how I could leverage that to have an even greater impact on patient care. So the more I learned about it, the more I could see that I could have a much greater impact, be closer to science, and be closer to patients. So I then had a shift, and I then was committed that was going to be my future. But as I said, I love taking care of patients. So it probably took me about another 3 years before I actually was willing to make the jump. And that's when I joined Pfizer.
Interesting. What I find interesting in that story is how you actually, I guess, medical liaisons hadn't been visiting you because you said you didn't know about medical affairs.
They had, but I honestly did not see that as a role for me. I just didn't understand enough. The interactions were very positive. I learned a lot, but I just did not. I see that as really two parallel worlds. And I never foresaw a point where I would actually change careers and actually join industry.
Interesting. Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. Because, a lot of the listeners that we have out there, they're people that work in industry, they work in healthcare, or some of them, a lot of listeners I have also coming from the Wall Street side. And I find it always fascinating that people who aren't in industry, sometimes, even though they're being visited by MDs, PhDs, PharMDs who are working, as field-based medical affairs professionals, they don't always understand exactly what they do or the difference. And I find that interesting, especially in today's era, because I would think today there's probably more awareness, probably of field medical teams versus, let's say, sales teams. But fascinating story, and in terms of how you ended up transitioning. Let's talk a little bit about the pipeline. As you know, as assets move through the pipeline, we face a lot of different challenges. When I was in industry, there's a lot of different things that we faced in trying to move assets forward through eventually commercializing those assets. What are you, from your perspective, what are you seeing as some of the biggest challenges in translating complex, let's say, data specifically in neuroscience or neurology into something that clinicians can confidently apply in real world practice? And I ask this question, specifically in light of some of the changes that have happened at the FDA and some of the policy and guidance changes, I'm sure around clinical trial requirements in terms of approvals. So I'm curious, I guess, one, what are those challenges? And two, how do you think that new FDA guidance, in effect, and now only requiring one clinical trial to be required in phase 3 for approval in many cases, is going to change, I guess, medical affairs or impact the industry?
Okay. So there's a lot there, Will. So let's start first and foremost with the pipeline. I think what's critically important with the pipeline is discipline. And I mentioned at the opening about the new Biogen. And when Chris Viehbacher came in and took leadership at Biogen, he was very focused in making sure that the company was set up for sustainable growth. And that really meant taking a critical look on our research and our development, and then how we would potentially commercialize, and making sure that we had the right mix of assets that would really set us up for success. As you know, neuroscience, there's often not a lot of de-risking that can happen before those pivotal trials. And you're tying up a lot of capital and a lot of time before you actually get the end result. That really puts you at significant risk. So he stepped back with the leadership team and said, what are our areas of focus that we have a right to succeed and where we have the skill sets to succeed? And it really comes down to 3 areas, and that's what we're building against. First is neuroscience, company that's founded on neuroscience, leader in MS, also a leader in Alzheimer's. Rare disease, revolutionize the care of SMA. Also have assets, as you know, for Friedreich's ataxia, SOD1 ALS, and now we have a rich pipeline also going to be evaluating Dravet syndrome and some other new assets such as salanersen for SMA. The third area is immunology. And Biogen, at its core, is a leader in immunology. MS at its root is immunology. The pathways, the science, all the research and development that went into it is easily applicable, whether it's to dermatology, rheumatology, et cetera. So those are three core pillars that we need to build on. So making sure that our research and development was aligned to that and that we would be set up for commercialization. So the next is making tough choices in the pipeline and making sure that we're pursuing the assets that we have a greater success of succeeding with, but then also keeping an open mind to, you still need to have those long shots, those moonshots where we can have a significant impact. So it's that nice mix. And that's what you see in our portfolio today. And the other part about our portfolio that's incredibly important to set us up for success is if you look at the number of assets in phase 3 right now that are either registrational ready or registrational enabling. We actually have 10 assets now that will be in phase 3 studies. That means that within the next year, and actually starting at the end of 2026, we'll have our first readouts from our Topaz studies. Both of those studies are going to read out the end of 26. It actually took a lot of effort to accelerate those trials to get that readout. Starting from that period, for the next 5 years, we're going to have 12 registrational ready trials reading out. That is a significant cadence of activity that's going to happen. Then brings the third piece. We need to actually have the people and the capabilities to be able to execute on all those. These trials are across neuroscience, rare disease, and immunology. When I say immunology, it means transplant, nephrology, rheumatology, and dermatology. So from a medical affairs perspective and wanting to come in and join an organization, I can look and say, here's an opportunity with clear direction, a really robust pipeline that's going to deliver in the short term, and the opportunity to actually build an organization to allow the current talent to take on new responsibilities and grow, but also to bring in new talent to complement what we already have. So that kind of sets us up of what we need to do for the pipeline and for the future. The other comment you mentioned is, what about some of the new guidance? I think we've heard the guidance about potentially one phase 3. I think we need to also have more details there. And obviously, if there are opportunities to pursue that, we want to make sure that the trials are ready and they're robust enough to be able to go down that path. But I think at this point, we still need to have a little bit more information about what that's going to entail.
Yeah, I agree. We need more details. Let's talk a little bit about people and capabilities, because as you know, you guys have a rich pipeline. Obviously, Biogen is doing great from that perspective. But as you know, oftentimes it hedges on how effective a team is in launching a product, right? You got to have, like you said, the skills, the capabilities, the know-how, and all the other dynamics like market access. That's not a medical affairs function per se, but as you know, right now, the payer market access landscape, it's a lot of scrutiny there, and it's difficult. It can be challenging. Talk to me a little bit about that. How is Biogen preparing for that?
So 2 things. One is leveraging the skills that are already present in the organization. And then the second, having a very critical appraisal of what we don't have and making sure we go out and we bring those skills into the organization. I think that that's going to really set us up for success. I spoke about rare disease. As you know, to be successful in rare disease, you need to have those core competencies of patient finding, patient engagement, work with the regulators, because it's oftentimes a different regulatory pathway. Those skills are here, and Biogen has been very successful. So that's clearly an area we can move to. The science, as I said, of immunology, clearly embedded here, as well as neurology. Some of the launch capabilities in these new therapeutic areas, that's what we'll need to bring people in from the outside that have had those experiences. And we're already off to a great start in that regard. We've brought in a tremendous amount of talent that have experience in these therapeutic areas that are going to be viewed as new for us. The science isn't new, but perhaps the commercialization will be a bit of a shift, but we're going to bring in the right people to do that and have already started. I want to go back to one comment you had mentioned earlier about the role of medical affairs and how do we translate the scientific information, right? Mm-hmm. As you know, a core competency of medical affairs is understanding and conveying the clinical trial data, particularly the pivotal clinical trial data, to the medical community, right? We often focus on, the p-value, was it significant or not? what I believe is even more important is, I call it the PI value, which is the practice informing value. Practice informing clinically relevant data is what a successful medical affairs organization needs to be doing from this point forward. It's not enough to just go and show the study results and know it in detail. We have to be able to tell that story about how and why it's important for that physician, for that patient that's sitting in front of them. That's the challenge. And that's the mindset that we need to have across the medical affairs organization. And it starts by us influencing our development team's study plan so that we can add certain endpoints in that we know are important. Or if they're not present, how do we do the appropriate analysis afterwards, whether it's a post hoc analysis, or do we put it into our IGP and make sure we're either doing a 3B or a phase 4 study, or leveraging real world evidence to address those questions that we know are going to be important to providers.
I love that you said that. I totally agree with you. I think the ultimate role of an effective field medical organization is bringing information that informs that clinical decision making, making sure, obviously, it's making sure it's objective, not biased, et cetera. And on that note, you got me thinking about another guidance that came out almost now a year ago from the FDA, was around scientific communications. And one of the things that the agency has pushed for is this idea of making sure that there's standardized credentialing for MSLs, for medical affairs professionals. From your perspective as a CMO, how important do you see standardized credentialing, accreditation for MSLs and medical affairs professionals? Because that's where I see a lot of companies now moving towards. They want to have that credentialing layer, whether it's from a compliance perspective, an effectiveness perspective. What's your take on that?
Yeah, listen, I think it's a great point, and there are many ways to get to the same point. I think what's most important, I think what you're getting at, is trying to guarantee that the same level of skill, of delivery, and ethics are applied across companies and across individuals within a given company. Whether that requires accreditation or whether it requires a concerted internal effort to make sure people are trained the right way and held accountable to those trainings. I think there are multiple ways to accomplish that. But at the end of the day, I think we need to make sure that we go out as a credible medical affairs organization. We're viewed as such, and we're delivering high quality medical information that's unbiased, that the medical community can rely on.
And I think a lot of that ultimately, it hedges on trust. One of the things I'm sure you saw recently in the news was the new guidance around Hep B vaccines. And just the other day on the podcast, we had the president of AAFP, the Academy for Family Physicians, and it was Dr. Sarah Nozel. We were talking about this issue of Hep B and, you know, the changes in the guidance and what it means to physicians and so forth and so on. And I think especially this year, there's a lot of confusion among the American public, and sometimes, unfortunately, that could be mistrust even. And so I guess, you know, question for you is, in this era that we're in right now, where there's more heightened scrutiny around data transparency, whether it's off-label discussions, changes in the guidance, what's happening with HHS, you know, the vaccines, things like that, what do you think pharma can do to help continue to, I guess, bolster that trust among the American public so that they feel like they're getting information that's transparent and as, you know, as objective as possible?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that North Star that we started with earlier, which is the patient. I think as long as it's clear that the information we're conveying is for the betterment of the care of that individual patient, and we should, and we're very transparent with the data, and we're very transparent with why we're saying what we're saying, and we show the supportive evidence, I think we're going to gain credibility. I think particularly when there may be adverse events, it's important that we get out in front and that we convey that information clearly and transparently. You know, I think the political climate being what it is, we can't control, there are things that are in our control and there are things that are outside of our control. What's in our control is to behave with integrity, to convey the data, and to try and actually convey that data in a way that the patients and the medical community can understand in a way that's meaningful to them. And if we do that consistently, they're going to trust us. And I think that's what's really important.
Yeah, I know. I absolutely agree. Let's talk a little bit about AI. We touched on it earlier on, but a lot of people that I talk to, whether it's in industry or elsewhere, they have a lot of interest about the role that AI is going to play in terms of pharma in particular related to drug development, but I would even say in terms of clinical trials and whatnot. And I guess from your perspective on the medical affairs side, talk to us a little bit about where you see the use of AI or advanced predictive analytics within medical affairs as we head into 2026. I'm sure you would agree the last 12 months have been mind-blowing in terms of the changes just that, we've seen with AI and the evolution of AI. Where do you see this going? Where do you kind of see, just at a high level, the use of AI within medical affairs or clinical development?
Yes, so I think a couple areas, and let's start with, let me frame it from a clinical practice perspective, right? This is no different than if you go back and think of clinical practice and a new technology coming into medical care and how is it used. What's most important, and this was something I took away from, when I was a resident at Hopkins, most important thing, if you sit down and you talk to a patient and you actually hear their voice, you get a really clear history, you do a thorough exam, 70 to 80% of the time, you're going to get the diagnosis. So what you need to know is what is that 30% where you need that extra test or where you need that additional technology, and how is it going to change? Is it to make a diagnosis for you, or is it to confirm a diagnosis? Where we ran into trouble, and you can run into trouble in healthcare, is when the test gets ordered before there's any thought, where there's any discussion with the patient, any thought process about why I need a particular test that I need. The exact same is true with AI. I think we have to be really clear about what are we trying to gain from it. What's the question we're trying to ask? Can it answer the question? And how are we going to measure that it's any better than what we were doing before? And then we need to, and if it can, then we need to employ it and scale it. So there are a few areas that I think are ripe. If you look at all of the insights, particularly field medical, the tip of the spear, probably the most important group in the medical organization to be bringing insights in and actually then conveying them back out to the medical community with an appropriate strategy. How are they really handled inside of an organization? Is this being done to an extent mostly manually, or can we really leverage AI to help sort through that? Not only to just collate them, but to look for patterns and to look for trends. At the end of the day, the teams still need to discuss them, but it's going to be much easier to spend their time discussing them than actually collating them and pulling them together.
Sure.
So to me, that's probably the lowest hanging fruit that we can use. But then also leveraging that AI to also pull in other sources. What else is being said in social media about some of these same questions? What's the follow-up at congresses that we could also pull in? What about the publications? How about MedInfo? So if all of this can actually be pulled in and then can be leveraged with really thoughtful, deep discussions, that's going to be a significant accelerator.
Yeah, I agree. I think insights are a big one. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And as you know, and I see this all the time working with pharmaceutical companies, the insights are gathered. Now, whether they're great insights or not, that can be, a question. But the problem that I've always seen is there's not much that happens with the insights, right? And that part of it is, historically it's been a lot of manual work. Do you think that AI is here to stay? And I know you might be surprised to ask that question, but I was speaking at a conference a few weeks ago, and I was asked that question. Someone said to me, a senior leader in medical affairs said, AI might be a fad. It might be here now, and we may not be using AI. Now, I tend to disagree, but I'm curious if you think it's here to stay.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, right? So I would say yes, and yes, it's here to stay. And we need to be very thoughtful about what are we calling AI, right? So I think also right now, a lot of people will throw AI on just about anything and will try and kind of sell it as the best thing. So you actually see a lot of companies spending a lot of money on projects that probably don't have any ROI. And that's a mistake. So the more that happens, the more there's going to be some distrust or maybe even distaste or lack of enthusiasm about pursuing AI. And that's where I get back to the way we're approaching it here at Biogen, right? We have to have a clearly defined project that we're addressing. It has to be measurable outcomes, and it has to be scalable. We actually have a core team at Biogen. It's called the AICT. So they actually pull through all of these innovations and evaluate them so that we can actually make much better decisions.
Yeah, and I would also say probably in addition just to the tools, the use of it, like knowing how to use AI, the AI literacy component.
Yeah.
That's really now emerging to be very, very important, because you can't just use AI for everything, and you have to know what tools to use for what particular objective or purpose. So AI literacy is proving to be really, really important in general across many industries. Given your experience and your role now as CMO, many people that are be watching are going to be up and coming medical affairs professionals, leaders, kind of at the mid management level. What would you give them as advice in terms of how to continue to, move up the ladder and be successful in their careers? We hear from a lot of people oftentimes they want to be able to accelerate and move up in their career, but they struggle. What are some of the things that you've learned over the years that helped you become successful?
Say a couple of critical ones. The first is you have to excel at your current role. You have to make sure that you are really delivering what you're supposed to be delivering for the team and for the organization, first and foremost. Second, especially for medical affairs, I always tell particularly younger associates, you want to be that person in the room that everyone wants when you're speaking with an outside KME, KOL, depending on how you speak with them, particularly someone who might be a little bit more argumentative, because you know the information so well. You understand the context in which our data belongs, and you can really engage in a very thought-provoking discussion and really show up as a peer. So from a medical affairs perspective, if you can represent that, you can deliver on your current role. And then the third part is I think you also need to broaden beyond your comfort zone. You have to make sure you don't just become pigeonholed into being a subject matter expert for this particular area. You need to take those stretches so it becomes clear you're not just a really strong leader in dermatology or in neuroscience, but that you're a really strong medical affairs leader that is valued in the organization.
Yeah, you have those broader skill sets. It reminds me of years ago, this is going back about 15 years ago, I was a medical director for a company, and they said to me, my leader came and said to me, you know what, we want you to present at the meeting where the CEO is going to be, and we want you to present the plan to the CEO for this particular asset. And of course, I was nervous because of course I had heard of the CEO, but I never met him live. And I tell you, what you said is spot on. You've got to do well in your job and be ready for every moment. I ended up presenting, thank God it went very successful. And from just that one encounter and that meeting at that company, because it was, everybody was there, all the leaders were there, that transformed everything. Because I was ready for that opportunity. And I always tell people exactly what you just said is sometimes you look ahead and we're thinking about the next position, but you've got to be really, really good at what you currently do. Show the results, bring the value, and your work and your value will speak for itself. I think that's really, really important. So I love that you said that. Tell me, Dan, in terms of people that have inspired you, whether it's, inspired you just in terms of your leadership, just your own personal values, or, for you to go into medicine, who would you say has really inspired you the most and kind of brought you to where you are today?
And very easy question for me to answer. Very fortunate. I'm first generation in my family to go to college. So my brother and my sister, so my parents were both incredibly intelligent people, but life circumstances didn't allow that for them. But they were both very successful. My father, who had two jobs, one was he was a battalion chief in a fire department. The second one was he also had a real estate business that he built himself. But watching him lead and things that were important for him and the way he actually counseled and brought people along for their careers was really important. The importance about selecting people based on their drive, their ability, and their integrity were kind of the most important things. And then the obligation then to make sure that you continue to mentor them and that you ensure that they had a successful career. So mentorship is really important for me. So I've been fortunate as well that I've had great mentors along the way after that throughout my medical career. And one in particular, when I was in medical school, my plan at the time was I was going to stay in the Brown system and was going to do my residency there and stay. one of my mentors pulled me aside and said, I understand you're going to stay. That's great. And he said, are you married? And I said, no. And he said, are you really tied up with someone that you have to be here? I said, no. And he said, you really need to push and step out of your comfort zone a little bit. And as a result of that, I ended up at Hopkins. And that completely transformed my life in so many different ways and opened up opportunities that I did not even know existed. So I think that's another great example of someone who had a significant impact on my life.
That's great. That's beautiful. What would you say, just in terms of what you want to leave the audience with, whether it's about Biogen, the direction you guys are headed, or just in general in terms of a leadership lesson, in terms of the industry? I'll leave it to you, to kind of give us the final word.
Yeah, I'll go back to where I started about the new Biogen, which is, to me, is incredibly exciting. I mean, to take a company that was a leader and the leader in MS care and to say, you know what, we know that to be successful going forward, we need to leverage all of these learnings. But going forward, we're going to focus in these 3 new key areas, and we're going to build an organization around that to be successful. And now we're going to focus going forward, not just on neuroscience, rare disease, and now immunology, and to build a pipeline that now is going to have this incredible cadence over, as I said, the next 5 years with 12 registrational readouts, to me is really impressive. And at the same time, pulling in some early assets into our research and early development organization. So to me, this is really what's going to be setting us up for success. And then the third piece is really having that commitment to build the talent internally and then to bring in the talent that's necessary to complement that skill. So I'm incredibly excited about our future, and I'm excited to build out the medical affairs organization over the coming years to really go along with that cadence of readout that's going to really have an impact on patients.
Well, it sounds like very exciting times ahead at Biogen. So I wish you the best. I wish the company the best. You guys are doing some wonderful things. It was great having you on the podcast, and we'd love to have you back again, maybe in a few months to kind of get an update and see where things are at. But it was great meeting you, and thanks again for being on the podcast, Dan.
Fantastic, Will. Thanks again. Really enjoyed it. Have a great day.
Thank you. All right, that's a wrap, Lucy. Thank you.
8, 3, 2, 1, live.
So Dan, tell us maybe something that you could pass on to colleagues within medical affairs that you picked up on from your past training.
So thanks for the question, Will. So if I go back, particularly to my time at Hopkins, there are a few things. What was really important there was the voice of the patient and how you really needed to ask the right questions, but more importantly, to listen. And that really transcended the way everything happened there. From bedside rounds where we would present the patient in front of the patient to the rest of the team. And that often gave an opportunity for the patient to actually speak up and say, no, that's not what I said, or I didn't mean that. And really the lesson was we had to be really careful about what we thought the patient was saying to us and make sure we really understood that if we were going to have the right impact. So today, when we hear from physicians what they say is important to patients, we have to be sure, do they really know? And in some instances they may, in some way they don't. And we've seen a number of studies that actually show there's disparate views. So we have to be careful. If we want to build strategies and have impact for patients based on the patient voice, we have to make sure that we're clearly hearing that. And then the other key takeaway was when we speak with physicians, we need to make sure we understand their knowledge base. Are they researchers? Are they really high volume clinicians, or are they both? And a great example came from a grand rounds at Hopkins, where they brought the patient in. It was actually on insulinomas. So very rare you say, well, I may never see this again in my career. At the end of the presentation, the physician said, one of the pearls that I picked up over the years is that oftentimes a family member might say to you, their personality changed. And that was kind of a key to the fact that they really did have an insulinoma. Years later, patient came in, was a referral, extensive $1 million workup, was unclear whether or not they had an insulinoma or not. If you look through the records, it would look like most likely they didn't. Maybe they had Munchausen's, right? They had previously had an extensive evaluation in the top center. And the woman came in and actually was quite angry, left the room to go to the bathroom, and her husband looked at me, they're newlyweds, and said, you have to help me. This isn't the woman I married. And it was, you hearken back to that clinical pearl that actually led to an extensive workup that actually found a woman did indeed have it. But it was based on something that from a high volume physician that oftentimes you could overlook. And
Sure.
it's just a good lesson on how we need to incorporate the voice, not only of the researcher, but also of that person who's seeing a lot of patients, because they can often give us really impactful insights that can help guide our strategy and other ways that we may need to use it for patient finding, et cetera. It's a rare example, but I think it's a good one.
That's a great example. And I love that you said that. The voice of the patient is so important. That's one of the things that I've really seen, I would say, over the last 10 to 15 years being in industry, is that's become more and more of a focus. And that's fantastic. It wasn't always like that when I started in the industry in the late 90s. And now that's changed completely. So great point.